Welcome to lecture number 18 of the course Linguistics 2 English 504. Now, as you can see in the first slide, the words written weaknesses of structural linguistics and functionalism. Now basically there are two different areas which we are going to discuss today. Now in the last lecture we stopped at a point where we talked about the structuralism, and we talked about the strengths that structuralism has and what are the contributions of structuralism in the world of linguistics. Now if we look at the review of lecture number 17, structuralism was a new movement and it was a reaction against the traditional and universal grammar. It studies a language employing certain procedures which linguists have formulated and tested and improved. So the structuralism talked about the empirical tested, the empirical ideas, the ideas which were valid, which was scientifically tested and which were proved, which were formulated, tested and improved. So they believed in structure. Their focal point was structure. Their focal point was a scientific method that proved the data. They believed in the inductive method of testing the data, and then they talked about the structure of language. A structuralist treats grammar as a device by which words are combined into larger units of discourse. Basic assumptions they had was the priority of the spoken language. They believed that spoken language enjoys prime importance. It enjoys the primary and the focal point in the structure of in the discussion on structure of language. They believed that oral scales, or the spoken language that precedes the written language, and it's basically the descriptive idea, not the prescriptive. Grammar is descriptive. They believed in descriptive ideas. They didn't believe in the prescribed text. Objective treatment of all languages, that was again another assumption of the structuralist movement. They said that languages should be treated objectively. Languages should be studied objectively. There should not be any subjective element. There should not be any subjective interference while studying language. All the languages, they had their own individual identity. They have their own distinctive entity. They are distinctive. They have their own features, and they should be treated independently of each other. There should not be any overlapping discussion or overlapping areas. Importance of synchronic description, and they talked about the language in synchronic approach. They rejected the diachronic approach. They said that history should not be brought into picture. Language should be studied synchronically, because language is basically the picture, the picture or the property of an individual at that very time. That is basically the language which matters, not the language which was which came in the past, or which may be in the future. So they studied language as it exists at that very time. Linguistics is descriptive, not prescriptive. They didn't believe in prescribed tests. They believed in the description. Language should be described as it is at that very time. It is not a prescriptive science. Language is a structure of structures. The whole structure of language has individual structures inside. It has structures in every level. At every level you have individual structures, at phonological level, at semantic morphological level, at semantic level, and then further on it has an individual, every level has an individual structure. So language overall is a system of systems. There are many systems lying inside the system of language. Language and utterance. What matters is the utterance. Language is important, the way it is uttered at that very time. So whatever is uttered, the spoken form of language, that is the actual form of language that is to be studied. So these are basically the things we talked about. a structural approach in the last lecture. Then finally, summing up the last lecture, we talked about the strengths. Chomsky says the major contributions of structural linguistics is methodological rather than substantive. They talked about the method, the way the structures are formed, the way the words are joined, the way the sounds are joined to form words, the way the words are joined to make sentences, and the way, the manner, the rules, the sentences are joined in order to create larger text. So there was a method involved. They talked about the method, the contribution of structural linguistics. The major contributions was methodological. There was a method involved. It made study of language scientific, precise, verifiable, and objective. So these were the things that we got after we analyzed language structurally. The language was made scientific, the language was made precise, the language was made verifiable, the language was made objective. Look at these words again: scientific, precise, verifiable, and objective. So all these qualities tell us that it's nothing to do with the inner structure, it's nothing to do with the deep structures of language. It's nothing to do with the inner world. It's nothing to do with what is already present in the mind of a speaker, or it has nothing to do with the grammar, universal grammar, the already present grammar which a child gets at the time of birth, the already grammar present in the mind of a learner, a language learner. So it has just to do with what matters here is the structure as it is evident, the visual form of the structure, the visual form of the structure of the sentences. That was basically the concern of the structural linguists. Now then, we finally put a question that whether structural approach or the structuralism just has strengths. Is it so strong that nobody criticized it? Well, the answer to this is no. There was criticism, and that criticism we are going to talk about today. In today's lecture, we talk about the weaknesses in structuralism. Then, after we've discussed the weaknesses, we're going to the next theory, that was the functionalism. So again, look at some of the further strengths it examines. We already talked about, examines all the languages in terms of their phonological and grammatical systems. It recognizes uniqueness of each language. We've already talked about it, that language is unique. Every language is a system, and it's a system of systems. Many systems are present inside a language, many systems at every level. Alright, now let's look at a new chapter, weakness of structural grammar. Where this theory was weak, where this theory faced criticism. Now, the first criticism we look at was from Chomsky. Chomsky criticized corpus bound's neglect of meaning. He said that basically the structural grammar is corpus bound. It is just based on a corpus, a text that is present in front of us. It neglects the element of meaning. Whether the text has an inner meaning or not, that doesn't come into picture. It just looks at that corpus, that text which is present in the front, and it looks at how the words have been put together to make sentences. So that is the first criticism we see here, that definitely when you see text and when you see utterances coming from speakers, or when you see the written text coming from the writers, there are certainly some meanings, hidden meanings. There are certainly some deep grammars, some deep structures involved which have given us those surface structures. Definitely the writer had something in mind which he wanted to communicate. The writer, the speaker does have something in mind which he communicates. So there was no consideration of that inside structure, or there was no consideration about the deep meaning. There was only a talk of the surface meaning, the apparent meaning which was there of the sentence which was visually in front of the language experts. Now, structuralism ignores explanatory adequacy, meaning, linguistics universals, native speakers' intuition, and its competence of generating infinite number of sentences from finite set of items. Now, these were basically what we saw in the generativism, that all these are the qualities of a person. Explanatory adequacy, there was not much explanation of how the rules they made those sentences, how the rules were put, what was the deeper meaning, what is the surface meaning, what deeper meaning gave us that surface meaning. There was no consideration of meaning. Structural grammar never talked about the meaning. Structural grammar, they talked about the visual structures, whatever structures were in front. Linguistic universals, some universal grammar, some universal language is already present with everybody, and that was ignored by this movement. That was ignored by the followers of structuralism. Native speakers' intuition, how a native speaker is tempted to utter different words, how a native speaker is tempted after being exposed to society, after getting after having interactions with people of other societies, how a native speaker is tempted, how a native speaker is motivated to learn new language, to utter new language. So what are the factors of a person learning new language? What are the factors behind a person's keenness to learn new language, person's desire to learn new language? So those factors were again ignored by the structuralism. His competence of generating infinite number of sentences, the finite set grammar, the finite state grammar we saw in the generative movement, the finite state grammar, where every person, every living being in this world has some capacity, has the ability to create language, has the ability to utter words. So again, structuralists, they ignored this area. They didn't have any consideration for that inner ability of human beings to create finite set of items from the infinite, to create infinite number of sentences from the finite set of items. The finite vocabulary, finite rules present already in the mind that gave rise to infinite or millions and billions of sentences we talked about in the generative ideas. So here again we see a criticism launched against the structuralists, that they ignored this factor, they ignored this idea that yes, some finite words or some finite rules are already present in the mind of speakers, which make them utter so many words and so many sentences. So now, going on to the next criticism, structuralism analyzes the date of a given corpus by means of inductive methods and formulates a grammar based on discovery procedure of data. Now, look at this statement. It analyzes the date of a given corpus. Whatever corpus comes in front of them, they see the date, they analyze the date when these words were uttered by means of inductive methods. Now here they apply inductive methods. They take the data and they test it empirically. So quite scientific and mathematical procedures are employed, and then they formulate a grammar based on discovery procedures of data. So whatever they discover out of the data, whatever they discover out of the analysis of that data, the data that came to them through scientific methods, through empirical methods, they analyze the data and then they formulate a grammar. To structuralists, now again this idea, to structuralists it was a very correct idea, but there was a criticism that how can you expect grammar or language of human beings coming out in the shape of coming out of the scientific procedures, or how people utter words that is based on scientific rules. Now this was a big criticism, because even if we analyze, even if we think about the language we utter, definitely when we utter some words, there are so many so many hidden feelings, there are so many hidden thoughts that make us utter different words, and sometimes we are under emotions, so emotions, they make us utter some words. So all those inner feelings, they were ignored. Language uttered was just scientifically tested. How many people said what? This was the empirical way. How many people said what at what time? So they just took that data empirically, and then they formulated a grammar that yes, these are the rules to join these sounds and these are the rules to join these words, just because so many people said these things at that time, and that they generalized that idea, and in order to after generalizing, they gave us a grammar, they gave us a language. Now human language is a human being is under so many stimuli when he talks or when he communicates. When we are talking to our we are with our family, or we are talking with our friends, we are under so many stimuli. The internal stimuli are affecting us, the external factors are influencing us, and we sometimes change our speech under the influence of these stimuli, and sometimes we don't mean to say what we say, but we just change the speech. So all these internal factors, all the external stimuli, they were ignored by the structuralists. They said that language is what? It is present after testing the empirical data, after testing the data through scientific and mathematical means. Now, to structuralists, grammar is a catalogue of elements, classified with restrictions enumerated, and relations made physically manifested. So grammar, what is it? It's just a catalogue. It's a list. It's an inventory list. It's a catalogue of what? Elements classified of with restrictions enumerated. The restrictions are there. Under these restrictions, these are the rules. So a catalogue of elements listed, mathematically listed in a scientific way, listed like they are listed in an inventory list. So what is language? Grammar, it is a catalogue. This is the structuralist view. Classified with what restrictions enumerated, and relations made physically manifested. Whatever the relations are there, they are because as they exist physically, as they exist there on the paper, as they exist as they are heard. There are no other relations. The deeper meanings have been ignored. The hidden underlying meanings have been ignored. What is happening inside the human mind, that is ignored. So whatever is coming out, what is visible is taken into account, and then grammar is formulated. Total corpus cannot be captured or verified. You cannot really have the overall impact of a corpus if you are looking at it as it is. You're just taking the visual impact of the corpus. You can't take the whole corpus, because it's difficult. Sometimes the poet might be under, or the corpus writer, or the writer of, for example, a text, literary text, or the poets who are writing, composing poetry, they might be under influence, some other influence to write certain words. So all the overall total corpus is difficult to take, because again, when you want to take data and you want to analyze it empirically, then it becomes difficult to take all the elements, because some of them might be taken qualitatively, some of them might be quantitatively. So the qualitative elements would be difficult, the qualitative factors will be difficult to bring under one list and to test them empirically. Language is not merely an inventory or catalogue of items, as structuralists imagine. So another criticism, that language is not an inventory. It's not an inventory. What is inventory? A list of items in at any place. Like you have the inventory list in your schools and colleges and universities, the things, the furniture, the physical things present in the university, you have a complete list of that. Or sometimes you make the list of house items present in the house, the furniture, the other things present, the chairs, the tables, all that comes in the, when you enlist that, that is called an inventory list. So they just wanted to make language an inventory list, a list of items, a list of rules, a list of phonemes, morphemes, a list of sentences, just the sounds. These are the physical sounds coming, and this is the way they have been linked together to create words, and these are the words that have been linked, and they are always linked because there are scientific rules. They have to be linked there. So structuralists failed to capture all ambiguities and relations. There could be so many ambiguities when you are uttering language. When you hear certain language, you hear words, there could be some ambiguities. Sometimes we are under the influence of ambiguities. We experience ambiguities in our life. Some of the things are not very clear to us, and we are confirmed from the speaker. So structuralists, they ignored those confusions. Structuralists said, what is coming is clear, is scientific. We have to take it. Now, we can't take a human speech as it is always, because sometimes there are ambiguities. A person may not mean what he is saying. A person sometimes, under some influences, may choose some language which is not understood, which is not comprehended by people. So they might confirm what the speaker meant. There are likely there are ambiguities. There are definitely some ambiguities sometimes, and sometimes the different words, the speaker uses different words in different relations, in order to create to change the focus, in order to put stress, in order to emphasize certain points. He just puts the words in different relations. So all these relations and ambiguities have been ignored, have not been taken into account by the structuralism followers. It does not include the idea of creativity. Now, what a great idea. Creativity, one of the special features of human being. Human beings are creative. They have an ability to create new things. They have an ability to create new texts. They have the ability to write new sentences, to write new words, to make new combinations of words, to change the emphasis. Like the poets, they are creating, they are creators. Like the artists, they are creators. Now, what are they creating? They are creating the masterpieces, the paintings. They are creating the poetic lines. How are they doing it? They are just changing the order of words. They are putting stress on special words. They are using the colors, they are using the different colors, combinations, in order to create new things. Whereas the structuralists, they ignored this factor. They ignored creativity. They did not include the idea of creativity, that man can be creative. Man can change the combinations. Man is capable of giving so many combinations, so many different masterpieces, so many different creations, because of his skills, because of his abilities. All that was ignored by structuralism. They said language is as it is, and it believes only in scientific rules. It does not account for the degree of grammaticality and acceptability, nor does it stop the generation of ungrammatical sentences. Now, look at this. No consideration for grammar. Grammaticality means the ability of people to change grammar, to create grammar, and also to acceptability, also be acceptable. Change the sentences and also be acceptable. Change meanings, give different meanings to their language, and be acceptable. Nor does it stop the generation of ungrammatical sentences. Again, when you get the human beings, sometimes they create ungrammatical sentence. Like, for example, in poetry, the poets they change in order to emphasize or change the end focus, change the focus of the sentence, change the meaning of the sentence, to put some underlying thought in a line. They would sometimes change the order of sentences. They would sometimes change the words. They would use the poetic devices, alliteration, and they would go for the similes and metaphors in order to put more meaning, or in order to emphasize certain parts of lines or sentences. Now, these are basically the ungrammatical, you may call them the ungrammatical sentences, that there is no grammar in that, there is no proper sequence in that, but yes, the meaning is there. So they are not stop, nor does it stop the generation of ungrammatical sentences. Well, if it has to be very scientific, it has to be very precise, then the structural grammar should consider the element of grammar, grammaticality and acceptability, and also should stop the generation of ungrammatical sentences. Then no ungrammatical sentences should come in case you are applying, you are studying language structurally. But we are constantly getting the ungrammatical sentences also, and we are constantly getting such meaningless sentences, but still beautiful lines, beautiful poetry lines, beautiful prose lines are being created by human beings, and structural grammar fails there, fails to study the logic behind these lines, because it does not include the element of creativity. It doesn't include the element of the inner grammar, the inner ability of people to create language. Grammar is not predictive and explicit. It does not explain the interrelatedness of sentences. So it's not predictive, doesn't predict what could come after that, after a certain sentence. It's not explicit. It's not grammar doesn't talk about the explicitly about the sentences. It does the language, and it doesn't explain the interrelatedness of sentences. What is the interrelatedness? It means that the sentences might have some link on the at the deeper level. They might be linked with the as far as the deeper meaning is concerned. So because grammar doesn't talk about the deep structures, structuralists don't talk about the deep structures, they don't talk about the deep meaning, they don't talk about what is inside the human mind already stored. So that is why that it fails here. It doesn't give us a relationship between sentences, the interrelatedness of sentences. It talks individually about the phonemes, individually about morphemes, and individually about syntax. So that is why that the relationships, the interrelationship of sentences is not brought into picture here. Now look at the next point. Grammar should not merely be a record of data. Well, it's a very, very mechanical way to grammar, putting it in the data, record of data. How can you put grammar, which is so broad, which is so vast? People are uttering millions and billions of sentences, and many new combinations are coming into picture. How can you put them in categories? You can't categorize them. You can't put it as a data, record of data. It is so vast. You get new combinations, you have the emotions coming into picture, you have the human feelings coming into picture while when language is composed. So it's very difficult, or rather impossible, to put it in under the categories, or to save it like a record of data. This was a big criticism against the structural grammarians. Now, it should establish the general and innate properties of the language based on intrinsic properties of human mind. Now here is that very important word, human mind. The generativists, they had a big consideration of human mind. Noam Chomsky said every human mind has something stored, has some universal grammar, has some structure stored in the mind. They are the raw structures, and then they come out as the proper formed, or as proper organized sentences. So this is basically the capability of human mind, the ability of people to create. They have the inner inbuilt ability to create language, to inbuilt ability to utter so many different combinations. But when we go on to structuralism, we see that it doesn't take into consideration the human mind, doesn't take into consideration what is universal. Now, the criticism here is that it doesn't establish the general and innate properties of language. What it should do is that it should take into account the general and innate properties of language, the language taken as general. They were taking language as specific, as scientific. They should take language as a general phenomena, and they should also take the innate properties of language, what is deep inside, what deeper meanings are there behind certain sentences, not the surface meanings. The structuralists, they talked about just the surface meanings, the visible meanings, the apparent meanings, the meanings which were in front. They in fact never brought meanings much into picture. They talked about the structures. They didn't take into account the deeper meanings or the meanings that could be underlying certain sentences. They just put stress on the surface meaning, the apparent meaning. So what they should do, basically, they should take it as a general phenomena. They should not take it as a scientific and specific phenomena. They should also talk about the innate properties of language based on what? Intrinsic properties of human mind. The innate properties of language. What are the innate properties of language? The deeper meanings, which are basically coming from the human mind. The intrinsic properties of human mind. The properties of human mind to create language, to create new combinations, to give surface meaning, to give surface structures from the deeper structures, to convert the raw structures into organized form. That is the quality of human mind. These are they come in the intrinsic properties of human mind. So what the structuralists should do, they should consider these qualities. They should consider the inner language stored, the deeper meaning stored under the words. Innate properties of language based on what? Intrinsic properties of human mind, the inner properties of human mind, the ability to create new combinations, the ability to convert the raw structures present in the mind, which they got genetically, got the raw structures to convert them into finished form. Linguistics is a subclass of cognitive psychology. Well, we have a very clear link here. Linguistics is a subclass of cognitive psychology. Psychology related with mind, the mental phenomena, the mental processes. Linguistics comes out of that. When you are studying language, you are also studying the human mind. So from cognitive psychology, when you are studying language, how the language is stored in the mind, how the words are stored, what is retained, and what comes out as organized in the organized form, you are basically you're taking a part of the psychology, a part of the mental processes. Whatever is going on in the human mind, speech is a part of that. So how that speech is organized, what is already present in the human mind, and how the words are taken, they are heard and they can taken into those parts of the brain which are working on language generation, how these parts are taken, how they are converted, how they are interpreted, and how they are comprehended, and then later on they are given in finished form, finished organized form. So linguistics is basically a part of that. Linguistics is a branch, a subclass of cognitive psychology. Now here, how can you ignore human mind when you see that linguistics is a subclass of is a part of psychology, it's a subclass of cognitive psychology? How can you ignore mind here? How can you ignore the human brain here? Because everything that is coming in the shape of language is coming from the human mind. You can't ignore the inner structure. You can't ignore the deeper meanings which are already present in the mind. So this was a big criticism, criticism against the structuralism. Language is both nature and nurture. It's not only the nature, it's also the nurture. Language is what a person has stored in the mind, and also language is what a person learns from the society. So when a child is born, already has some grammar present in the mind, and then when the child hears more words, more sounds around him, he takes those sounds, those words, learns those words, and starts making sentences, and gradually grows into adult. Gradually, with the passage of time, all his life, he keeps on adding to the storehouse of his language. So that is what is happening in the mind. From nurture, it's nurture, nature, the psychology, and nurture, how the society is adding up to the language, how the person is learning language from the society. You can't just ignore nature. You can't just talk only about nurture, or you can't just talk only about nature, because definitely we saw in the previous classes that language is changed. Language is changed under the influence of society. Language has variations under the influence of society, under the influence of culture, mixing up of different cultures. So you have to consider both. You have to consider the nature as well as the nurture. Now, grammar should also specify what to say, when and why. Now here, grammar is just taking, the structuralists are just looking at what is present. They are taking what is present, whereas actually grammar should say what to say, what is present, what to say, when it is when to say, and why to say. So this when and why is decided by human mind. It's not only what to say. Again, I would say that what to say again is also linked with the human mind, because you only decide what to say after thinking. You have to say different things on different occasions. You have to greet people on different occasions in different ways. You greet, for example, you greet people of different societies in a different way. There are different ways to greet. There are different ways to say farewell. There are different ways to talk. There are different ways to behave in different situations. So whatever you are saying in different situations, you are thinking about that. Whatever you think, whatever you imagine, you utter that, and that you imagine inside your mind what to say, and then when to say, what is the right time to say to say certain things. You can't get on with saying everything at every time. Like sometimes in our houses, we stop the children from being too talkative. A very interesting example, that we tell a child to just think before a child speaks, and children, they are so immature that they can't really decide what to say and when to say, and whatever they hear, they utter it before everybody. So that decision, of course, comes with experience. The power to make decision comes with the experience. So again, that is related with that is linked with the human mind. So whatever you say, when you say it, and why. What are the reasons why you're saying something? What are the reasons behind? You were using the word behind, means the reasons are behind, underlying, hidden, inside the mind. So grammar should talk about what to say, at what time, when to say it, and why it should be said. Whereas grammar talks about, the structuralist grammar talks about what is present, and that's it. What is present, in what shape, and that is. Why it was said, why it was uttered, and when it should have been uttered, or is it the right time to be uttered or the wrong time to be uttered? Is it the right way to be uttered, and is it the right reason, right occasion to be uttered? The structuralist grammar doesn't take into picture all these things, doesn't consider all these things. It just takes the surface structure, it just takes the grammar as it is present. Now, moving on. Structural grammar does not fulfill all these goals. It is not a whole, but a part of the whole. An inventory of units such as phonemes, morphemes, words, lexical categories, and phrase. Now, all these are individual levels of language. Structural grammar discusses them, talks about them individually, giving them individuality, giving them a distinctive place in the whole system. Doesn't talk about the link, doesn't talk about the relationship. It just puts these units in an inventory list, puts them in a long list, just like you put articles, just like you put things in an inventory list. Now, descriptive grammar is just one aspect of generative grammar. When you talk about the descriptive grammar, that is just one aspect. You are not talking about the whole, all the aspects of generative grammar. When a grammar is generated, you don't talk only about the descriptive grammar, but you also talk about the things which are underlying which are related with that. So descriptive grammar is just one aspect of generative grammar. No, descriptive grammar doesn't talk everything about the generative grammar. It's just like it talks about one aspect. It doesn't cover all the things. It doesn't cover the related things. Now, structuralism fails to speak anything about the nature of language and fails to establish a relationship between sound and meaning. So, fails to talk anything about the nature of language. What is the nature, what is basically the actual nature, or what is actually the origin of language. Talks just about the apparent structure, doesn't talk about the underlying meaning, the underlying nature of language. And it also fails to give us a relationship between sound and meaning. What is the sound, how it, why it was uttered, what was the meaning of this sound. That is not structural grammar domain. Structural grammar talks only about the sound, not the meaning, the underlying meaning behind that. A grammar should also account for deep structures. A very apparent idea, we've already talked about it again and again, that doesn't take into account the deep structures. The deeper meanings have been ignored, only the surface meanings have been taken. It should give a factually accurate formulation of rules. Factually accurate, not the accurate only, but factually. What is the ground reality? What is the reality behind these rules? It only talks about the accuracy, doesn't go into the factual things. What were the facts behind this utterance? What are the actual underlying facts, underlying reasons behind this utterance? So that it should take into account. It should give such rules that generate deep and surface structures, not only surface but also deep structures. It should give such rules that discover the interrelatedness of sentences. Summing up to the weaknesses, summing up this discussion, we would say that what the structural grammar should do, it should give us such rules which discover the interrelatedness of sentences and also talk about the deep and surface structures. It should give such rules that give phonetic transcriptions of surface rules and semantic interpretations of deep structures. Now see, it talks only about the surface rules, what is apparent. So what is phonetic, what are the sounds, what are the words, whereas the actual thing is that the semantic interrelationship of deep structures is a very important factor that the structural grammar ignores. What it should do, it should give us such rules. We should talk about the apparent surface rules, the phonetic transcriptions, the phonetic combinations, the sounds of the surface rules, and then going deep inside, going behind that, it should talk about the meanings. It should talk about the semantic interpretations, the meanings of the deep structures. That is how the whole phenomena, that is how the whole process is completed. The units logically prior to the grammar is logically prior to the units. The units are logically prior to grammar, they come before grammar, and the grammar is before the units. So they work in combinations, they work together with each other. It's not only the units, it's also the grammar. The units of the grammar, they are related with the grammar, and the units, they have deep structures, they have so many related structures, they do affect the units, and the units also affect the grammar. So they are logically prior to grammar, and the grammar is logically prior to units. So this means they are working in combination. It concentrates on structuralism and ignores the native speaker's competence. Okay, talks only about structuralism, focuses only on the structures, and ignores the actual ability of person to utter a language, to utter sentences, the native speaker's competence. We've discussed about competence so many times, the ability to utter language, the ability to generate utterances, the competence, the power, the skill to utter language. So it doesn't talk about that. It doesn't talk about the inner ability, the inner competence level of a speaker. It talks only about what comes out. That's it. No hidden meanings, nothing behind. It also ignores the psychological and sociological side of the language. Psychological, of course, again related with human mind, again related with brain. It ignores that, and sociological side as well, that how language is varies when people are interacting in societies. What is the sociological side of language? How a society affects language, and how language changes under the influence of society. So that also is ignored. They are just looking at the structure of the sentence, not the impact of the mind, or the effect of the mind, or not the process of the mind which gave us that utterance, but they are just looking at the utterance, not the impact of society even. They are not looking at the social side as well. So this is what we had about the weakness of structuralism. Now here we have a new movement, a new idea, functionalism. What is basically functionalism? A new movement, a particular movement with structuralism, within structuralism. Phonological, grammatical and semantic structure of languages are determined by functions they have to perform in societies which they operate in. So they are giving us a new idea here that phonology, grammar and semantic structure of languages, they are studied under the influence of their function, related to their function in societies, what role they are playing in societies. The representatives of functionalism are the members of Prague School, a special movement, a new movement coming from Prague School linguists. They are basically talking about functionalism. Now, who are these people? It had its origin in the Prague Linguistic Circle, founded in 1926. This was the background. Prague Linguistic Circle. It was particularly influential in the European linguistics in the period preceding the Second World War. Some of the history of this school. The Prague School rejected. Now here is the important contribution. Here is the important breakthrough. The Prague School rejected Saussurean distinction of synchronic and diachronic linguistics and homogeneity of language system. They said language is not homogeneous entity. Language is not one. Language is not common with all the people. They rejected this Ferdinand de Saussures idea. They said there is no consideration of synchronic and diachronic. There is nothing like synchronic and diachronic approaches of language. It is not a common thing with all the people. Now what did they say? The Prague School first made its impact in phonology. The first thing they studied was phonology. One of the members was Trubetskoy. He drew a line between phonetics and phonology. He said phonetics and phonology are two different things. He said phonetics is basically the parole and phonology is lang. So he differentiated the two things. The distinctive functions of phonetic features is only one kind of linguistically relevant function. So what is the function of phonetic features? What do they do? What is their role? That is only one kind of linguistically relevant function. And what is that function? Other is just, the phonetics are just giving sounds, and others are demarcative functions and expressive functions. So the other roles, what are the other roles which they are playing? Demarcative, they just demarcate. They just put the boundary. When studying a sentence, they just demarcate. They just give us the demarcations, the boundary, the limits of certain words, the limits of certain sounds. Most of the suprasegmental features are stress, tone, length. So the segmental features, the suprasegmental features, what are they? The stress, tone, length. So they were again basically talking about the structures, talking about the phonological structures. This was the first thing that came under their study, that they were talking about the stress, the tone, the length of sentences, the length of the words. They were talking about the stress pattern. They were talking about the emphasis pattern. They have a demarcative rather than a distinctive function in particular language function. So what are they doing? The phonetic sounds are just demarcating. They are giving us boundaries. They don't have a distinctive feature. Rather, they are just playing the role of demarcation, of demarcating boundaries, having boundaries, dividing them, creating the different individual constituents of sentences. They're called, that is why they're called boundary signals. The boundary signals are basically, what are they doing? They are just demarcating. The phonetic symbols are just demarcating. They do not serve to distinguish one form from another on the substitutional paradigmatic dimensions of contrast. They reinforce the phonological cohesion of forms. They are basically talking about they are serving to create boundaries, to create dimensions of contrast. How the sounds are used, how sounds are used in contrast with each other to create contrasting sounds and to create contrasting emphasis, contrasting stresses in the sentence. They do not serve to distinguish, they do not distinguish one form from another on the substitutional dimension. No paradigmatic. No consideration of time, how the sentence was in the past and how it's going to be in future. They are not linking the sentences, what they are presently and what they were in the past. So they are not distinguishing one form from the another, one structure from another on the paradigmatic dimensions. Basically, they are just talking about the phonological cohesion of forms, how the forms they were linked together, and how they were merged together, and how a cohesion occurred at the phonological level, at the sound level. No consideration of the time here. They help to identify them syntagmatically as units by marking the boundary between one form and another in a chain of speech. So syntagmatic approach. Basically, they are taking the sentence at horizontal level. No consideration about the paradigmatic approach. They are taking a sentence at the horizontal level and they are studying the form, they are studying the phonetic symbols, they are studying the relationship, they are studying how the phonetic symbols have been linked together, how the phonetic sounds have been linked together to make words and to make sentences. So syntagmatic, they are identifying them on horizontal level, syntagmatically as units, separate units, and they are marking the boundary where one sound stops and the next sound is uttered. So they are just dividing them into small units, dividing the sentences into small units, and they are looking at their role, what role they are playing, like a chain of speech. They are taking in a speech as a chain. So they are a chain which has different small links on the horizontal level. So they are taking the small links of a chain which are important. In English, there are no more than one primary stress associated with each word form. They say that one word has just one stress, not more than two stresses. You can't stress a word, you can't have two different stress patterns for words. The position of primary, some of the facts that were given by this school, the position of primary stress on English word forms is partly predictable and does not identify boundary as it does in languages with fixed stress like Polish, Czech and Finnish. So comparison done by this school, Prague school, that they were looking at the studying different languages, and they say that the position of primary stress in English word forms is partly, the position of primary stress on English word, the forms is partly predictable. You can not exactly predict. So it's partly predictable and does not identify boundary as it does in languages with fixed stress. In Polish, Czech and Finnish, they have languages with fixed stress. But in English, sometimes it can be predicted, it can be changed, but it's not completely predictable, it's partly predictable. Word stress does have an important demarcative function in English. Well, stress, as we see in everyday language, word stress does have an impact. Words are stressed to emphasize. You change the stress pattern sometimes to change the emphasis. So they play word stress does have an important demarcative functions. When you change the stress, sometimes the meaning of the sentence changes. An expressive function of the phonological feature is meant by its indication of the speaker's feelings and attitude. Now you can't ignore here the speaker's feelings and attitude, the expressive function of phonological feature, how some phoneme or some sound is stressed, that comes from the speaker's feelings. That is an indication somewhat of the speaker's feelings and attitudes. For example, word stress is not distinctive in French and it doesn't play a demarcative role the way it plays in many languages. Another fact, another comparison, in French, word stress is not distinctive. Words are not stressed. Words are not stressed for emphasis. The emphasis is not changed. An emphatic pronunciation of the beginning of the word shows expressive function. What expression is there when you emphasize certain words, when you emphasize pronunciation of the beginning of the word, that shows that your expressive feelings, that shows the expressive function that sound is playing in the sentence. Every language puts a rich set of phonological resources at the disposal of its users for expression of feelings. Well, another very important fact that every language gives a rich set of phonological resources. People have a lot of resources. People have a big storehouse of sounds. Every language has so many sounds, and these sounds are with the people for the expression of feelings, and they can express their feelings in different ways, using different stress patterns. Functionalists emphasize on the multifunctionality of a language and the importance of its expressive, social and connotative functions. Connotative functions along with its descriptive function. Now, functionalists emphasize on the multifunctionality of language and the importance of its expressive and social functions along with its descriptive functions. So what are functionalists doing? Functionalists are basically talking about the multifunctionality. Language plays different functions, and the importance of its expressive and social. Language plays expressive functions, language plays social functions along with its descriptive functions. So the Prague school has introduced these ideas. They are also talking about the expressions. They are also talking about these social functions. So they are including the human feelings, the expressions, the expressions of the society, the behavior of the society, also with the descriptive function or with the descriptive role that the language is playing. So language is more than just description. You also have to include the feelings of expression, the feelings of function, society, roles of society. You also have to include the emotions. You also have to include the feelings of the speakers along with the descriptive study of language. Now, an important contribution to Prague School is functional sentence perspective. For example, FSP. Now, let's look at an example. This morning, he got up late. He got up late this morning. Now, here, 1 and 2 are conditionally equivalent, and they have the same meaning. But the context of 1 and 2 differ systematically. When 1 would be uttered and when 2 would be uttered, where the stress is in sentence 1 and where the stress is in sentence 2. This morning he got up late. He got up late this morning. Now here you can change the stress pattern if you want to emphasize he got up late this morning. This morning he got up late. So the stress is changing. First sentence you are uttering, you're focusing on this morning. But in the second sentence, you're focusing on he. He got up late this morning. You're giving more importance to the word he in the second sentence and to the word morning, this morning in the first sentence. So they're conditionally equivalent, but they differ. The contexts are different. When 1 would be uttered and when 2 would be uttered, these occasions are different, the contexts are different. Here you're putting that human element into it. Here you're putting that the expression, feelings of expression, the feelings of focus, the feelings of emphasis in the picture. Now, in some languages, the syntactic structures of utterances and of sentences is determined by the communicative setting of the utterance. You look at the communicative setting, the context. In what context an utterance is made. Syntactic structures of utterances and of sentences is determined by the communicative setting, the context. What context? What setting was there for a certain utterance? This is this is included along with the descriptive explanation of utterance. So you are the syntactic structures, sometimes they are determined or they are studied, they are analyzed, keeping in mind the communicative setting of that utterance. This is called functional sentence perspective by Prague School. Now here this term given by this Prague School linguistics, the functional sentence perspective. So remember this term, functional sentence perspective. When the utterance, studying utterance, you include the elements of the element of communicative setting of the utterance, the context in which a sentence is uttered. Functionalism in linguistics emphasizes the instrumental character of language. Now, they talk about the instrument, what role language is playing. Like instruments, they are used in different operations, or instruments in different kind of jobs. You have different instruments being used by people. So what is the role of this instrument language? What is the instrumental role of the language in the life of a person, or in the life of the development, in the life of language, or in the process of development of language? What role language is playing, emphasize. This is the concern of the functionalism. Now functionalists in linguistics, they emphasize what role, what mechanical role, what instrumental role of language is there. Functionalists maintain that the structure of national languages is determined by several independent semiotic functions, which are expressive, descriptive, and social. So they are also including the semiotic functions, the signs functions, what different signs human beings are used for expression, for describing for things, and what different signs are they're coming from the social settings. There are different signs are coming from the society. So functionalists maintain the structure of normal languages. How to study the structural language? That includes several independent semiotic functions, which are expressive, which are descriptive, and which are also social. Furthermore, it says that structure of language system is partly, though not wholly, determined by functions. It's partly, they are including, they are linking the element of functions, the element of the role of language. Partly, the structure of language is partly, though not wholly, determined by functions. They are not putting the whole stress on functions, they are just linking it. They say, well, you do have to consider what role language has to play in society, and you must analyze the structures, you must analyze the language looking at the role it plays in the society. All right, coming on to the summary of today's discussion. Prague School rejected Saussurean distinction of synchronic and diachronic linguistics and homogeneity of language system. What did they do? They basically rejected Saussurean distinction of synchronic and diachronic linguistics, and also the homogeneity of language system. Now, functionalists emphasize on the multifunctionality of language and the importance of its expressive, social, and cognitive functions along with its descriptive functions. What did they emphasize on? They emphasized on the multifunctionality of language. Language plays many roles. Language doesn't have only one role. And the importance of its expressive, social, and cognitive functions. You have to include the expressive factor, the social factor, and the cognitive factor also along with the descriptive factor. Functionalism in linguistics emphasize the instrumental character of language, what instrumental role language is playing. Functionalism in linguistics emphasizes the instrumental character of language. Functionalists maintain that the structure of national language is determined by several independent semiotic functions, which are expressive, descriptive, and social. Furthermore, it says that the structure of language system is partly, though not wholly, determined by functions. We also had a discussion on the weaknesses of structuralism and the attacks on structuralism, the criticism that was launched against structuralism in the earlier part of today's discussion. What was that? That the structuralism did not consider any deeper meanings, did not consider what was the underlying meaning of sentences. It looked only at the surface structure, did not give any importance to the inner grammar, the inner structures present inside the mind of people. It just talked about what was the apparent meaning, what was the apparent structure. It never brought meaning into picture. What the structuralism should do? Structuralism, structural grammar should give us those structures which have surface and deeper meaning both. Whereas, and it should also bring into consideration the factors like the psychology, the factors like the psycholinguistics, how the language is made in the generated by mind, because linguistics is basically a part of the study of brain and a part of the study of psychology. So structuralists, they failed on that part, that they failed to include that element which was underlying. They just looked at the apparent structure, nothing behind that, and they ignored the meaning, they ignored the writers, the speakers' hidden meaning that could be there behind that utterance. So this was all for today. We discussed the weaknesses of structuralism, and we also discussed a new movement, functionalism. We'll proceed with these movements, we'll proceed with the discussion in our next lecture. Till then, it is Khuda Hafiz. Goodbye.